When we talk about ancient Greece, we most often imagine white marble temples, gatherings of citizens on the agora, philosophers reflecting on the nature of virtue, and theatrical performances under the open sky. This image is bright, but incomplete. Behind the beauty of art and the brilliance of democracy lay a harsh reality that is often left untold. The foundation of Greek civilization was built on slavery, and without it, none of the achievements of Athens or Sparta would have been possible. Slavery was not an exception, but the rule. According to historians, in Athens there could be up to 3 slaves for every free citizen. Their labor sustained everything, from the extraction of silver in the mines of Laurion to farming, household work, and serving the wealthy at their banquets. The fate of those sent to the mines was especially horrific. Narrow underground tunnels filled with dust, dampness, and poisonous gases turned their lives into a short countdown toward inevitable death. Life expectancy in such conditions was just a few years, and no one considered these deaths a tragedy. The dead were simply replaced with new slaves. Slave labor was the basis of the economy, and therefore of democracy itself, because free citizens had time for politics and philosophy only thanks to the exhausting labor of others. But slavery in Greece was not only physical. It permeated culture, everyday life, and even thought. Slaves were stripped not only of freedom, but also of identity. Their names were replaced with Greek ones, they were forbidden to speak their native languages, and they were deprived of their traditions and faith. Bit by bit they lost all ties to their past, becoming blank slates on which their masters could write whatever they wished. The destruction of individuality was one of the most effective tools of subjugation. Perhaps the greatest paradox lies in the fact that the very elite who prided themselves on philosophy and high ideals simultaneously demonstrated horrifying cruelty. At the famous symposiums, often described in textbooks as gatherings for intellectual conversation, the reality was far darker. These feasts, beginning with discussions of poetry, politics, and science, regularly ended with humiliation and violence against slaves. They were forced not only to serve wine and food, but also to entertain the guests in the most degrading ways. Historians mention that many of those we now revere as wise men and philosophers took part in such practices, seeing no contradiction between writing about virtue in the day and violating human beings at night. This dissonance was explained simply. For the Greeks, slaves were not considered full people. Aristotle even wrote that some men were slaves by nature and that their destiny was to serve others. Such a philosophy justified every form of exploitation. This moral blindness was perhaps the deepest flaw of antiquity. The same society that created ideals of freedom and democracy deliberately denied those ideals to a vast portion of its own population. The Athenian slave market was one of the clearest manifestations of this logic. Slaves were displayed like merchandise, their bodies rubbed with oil to highlight their muscles, their appearance described in detail, and their physical qualities advertised to potential buyers. People of all ages stood side by side, children, adults, and the elderly, while buyers examined them as coldly as if they were livestock. It was at once a banal and terrifying spectacle, considered a normal part of social life rather than a tragedy. And yet, even under such pressure, fragments of resistance survived. Slaves clung to their humanity in small ways, sharing stories about their homelands, singing songs in whispers, or crafting small figures out of clay and wood hidden from their overseers. These tiny acts of defiance became the last line of defense against a world determined to erase them. It is important to understand that the dark side of Greece was not a minor flaw in an otherwise perfect culture. It was the foundation without which philosophy, theater, and democracy could not have flourished. This duality forces us to ask a disturbing question. Are we repeating the same mistakes today, only under different names? After all, our world too builds its comfort on the suffering of others. Factories where people work for pennies, systems where the vulnerable are treated as disposable, corporations that hide exploitation behind legal and economic jargon, all of these echo the very same mechanisms. We condemn the ancients, but often we close our eyes to modern slavery, excusing it as necessary. In the hidden corners of ancient Greek society, where the brilliance of temples and philosophy shone brightest, a darker practice thrived. Children were often treated as a form of currency. For poor families struggling with hunger, debt, or the consequences of a bad harvest, the unthinkable became a harsh necessity, giving up their children into slavery. This was not merely a rare tragedy, but a systemic practice woven into the very structure of Greek life. Children were considered one of the most vulnerable yet valuable resources a family possessed. Unlike land or livestock, children could be liquidated quickly. They could be handed over to creditors, sold at a market, or given as a pledge until debts were paid. For families facing famine or overwhelming debt, there was often no other choice. Grain shortages, natural disasters, or even a single failed harvest could drive a household into desperation. And in such circumstances, the weakest, the children, were turned into the coin of survival. The fate awaiting these children was particularly grim. Unlike adults, they entered slavery with decades of service ahead of them. This made them highly desirable to buyers who saw not only physical labor, but also the opportunity to mold the young into obedient servants, stripped of memory and will. Children were easier to break, easier to adapt, and, tragically, they often grew to accept their condition as normal, having little or no memory of freedom. This brutal transformation robbed them of identity long before they could fully form one. Some children ended up as household slaves in the homes of the wealthy, where they were trained to serve at banquets, clean, cook, or act as companions for other children. On the surface, such roles may have seemed less harsh than mining or agriculture, but they were nonetheless marked by exploitation, dependence, and a total lack of autonomy. Other children were sold into trades, becoming apprentices not by choice, but by coercion. In craft workshops, they might learn pottery, weaving, or metalwork, but the fruits of their labor never belonged to them. Instead, their skills enriched their owners, while the children themselves remained property bought and sold at will. In the worst cases, children ended up in mines or brothels, their lives brutally shortened by work or abuse. The contrast between these realities and the celebrated ideals of Greek culture is staggering. Philosophers praised freedom and the pursuit of virtue, while in the very same cities, children were stripped of freedom before they even understood what it meant. Aristotle famously justified slavery as natural, but the existence of child slaves reveals the chilling limits of such rationalizations. How could one argue that a child with no chance to choose was naturally destined for bondage? The marketplace reflected this cruel paradox. In slave markets, children stood alongside adults, their small size no shield against the gaze of buyers. Sellers would emphasize their youth as an advantage, pliability, long years of labor ahead, the ease of training. Families arriving to sell or surrender a child were often forced to watch as potential buyers inspected them, as though they were livestock. The transaction was treated as ordinary business, even though for the family it meant permanent loss, and for the child, it meant a lifetime of servitude. Yet, even in such bleak circumstances, there were small sparks of humanity. Some children, taken in as household slaves, were treated with a measure of kindness and even educated alongside their master's children, though always as inferiors. A few rare cases are recorded where freedmen remembered their early years as slaves and were able to reclaim some part of their identity. But these were exceptions, not the rule. The overwhelming reality was that children became invisible commodities, their suffering erased by the normalization of the system. This practice also reveals something crucial about the fragility of the common Greek household. The slave trade in ancient Greece was an integral part of the economic and social system, functioning as openly and systematically as any other form of commerce. Slave markets were typically organized in large urban centers, such as Athens, Corinth, and Delos, where they resembled bustling bazaars filled with voices, bargaining, and the clinking of coins. The process of buying and selling human beings was conducted with an efficiency that reveals the normalization of slavery in Greek society. Slaves were displayed in rows, often stripped of their clothes to allow potential buyers to examine their bodies in detail. Merchants and auctioneers treated them like cattle, advertising their strengths, skills, and obedience while concealing flaws or rebellious tendencies. Buyers would meticulously check teeth to judge age and health, squeeze muscles to assess physical strength, and scrutinize overall appearance, since beauty and youth could raise a person's price dramatically. Traders categorized slaves into distinct groups, each intended for specific roles. The strongest and most enduring were sold for agricultural labor, destined to toil under the sun in vineyards, olive groves, or fields of grain. These men and women represented the backbone of Greek agricultural productivity, but also endured some of the harshest conditions, often chained and supervised to prevent escape. Another category consisted of domestic slaves, whose primary role was to serve within households. They cooked meals, cleaned, tended to children, fetched water, and ran errands, forming the invisible machinery that sustained aristocratic Greek lifestyles. Their closeness to their masters could sometimes grant them a higher quality of life compared to field slaves, yet it also subjected them to constant surveillance and complete dependency. Some slaves with education or special talents were marketed as highly valuable assets. Those who could read, write, or perform skilled crafts fetched higher prices and might serve as tutors, accountants, or artisans. Their intellectual or artistic contributions could bring prestige to their owners, but this status did not erase the fact that they remained property without autonomy or freedom. A particularly disturbing aspect of the market was the sexual exploitation of enslaved people. Attractive men and women, especially the young, were purchased specifically for pleasure, and their worth was determined not only by physical beauty, but also by submissiveness and exotic origins, which were fetishized. This dehumanizing commodification blurred the line between ownership and abuse, turning human beings into objects of desire and profit. The markets themselves operated with rules and customs, sometimes guaranteed by the city authorities. Buyers were offered short-term warranties. If a slave turned out to be sick, disobedient, or misrepresented, they could be returned, much like faulty merchandise. This legal framing of human lives as goods for exchange underscores the deeply ingrained brutality of the system. The prices of slaves varied depending on origin, skills, and physical condition. Thracians, Scythians, and Asians were among the most common captives, often taken during wars or raids, and their identities were stripped away as they were assimilated into Greek households. Women from foreign lands were particularly valued in domestic and sexual roles, while men were pushed toward heavier labor. At large, trading hubs like Delos, thousands of slaves could be sold in a single day, making the island infamous throughout antiquity for its sheer scale of human trafficking. The normalization of such markets left deep scars not only on those enslaved, but also on Greek culture itself. While philosophy, art, and democracy flourished, they were financed and sustained by a foundation of human suffering. The sight of slaves being bought and sold was so common that it became invisible to most citizens, reflecting a chilling capacity for moral dissonance. The double morality of the ancient Greek elite was most visible in their relationship with slavery. On the one hand, Greek philosophers laid the foundations of ideas about justice, law, and virtue that shaped Western civilization. Plato and Aristotle speculated about the nature of man, the essence of a worthy life, the search for truth and harmony. In popular assemblies, citizens debated laws, equality, the structure of the state, and the value of freedom. Yet all these ideals applied only to free male citizens. Women, resident foreigners known as metics, and especially slaves were excluded. Slaves were seen not as human beings, but as living tools, whose sole purpose was to work for their masters. For this reason, the elite experienced no contradiction between lofty philosophical discussions and cruel treatment of dependents. Aristotle openly claimed that some people were slaves by nature, destined for subjugation, while others were born to rule. This philosophical justification reinforced social hierarchy and normalized exploitation. At the same time, Aristotle wrote entire treatises on justice, friendship, and ethics, stressing that without justice, society cannot survive. For the elite, there was no conflict here. The slave was considered an incomplete being, outside the realm of morality. Politicians and military leaders in Athens and Sparta, who spoke loudly about liberty, democracy, and civic virtue, themselves owned dozens of slaves. Sparta's famous system of military education depended on the subjugation of the helots, who were humiliated, terrorized, and even killed to instill fear. Athenians, who proudly proclaimed themselves defenders of democracy, relied on slave labor and tolerated their public degradation. Slave markets displayed human beings for inspection and sale, even as citizens debated equality in the same city squares. Even more striking was the gap between philosophy and personal behavior. Many powerful citizens considered it normal to use slaves for sexual purposes. Female slaves were forced to serve their masters, while young male slaves were often subjected to exploitation, justified by the belief that they had no rights and did not belong to themselves. From the elite's perspective, there was no moral contradiction. A philosopher could preach virtue as the highest path for a citizen, but since a slave was not a citizen, the rules of ethics did not apply to him. This double morality allowed the elite to maintain a sense of moral purity and intellectual greatness, even as their wealth and lifestyles rested on systematic humiliation and suffering. Their philosophical schools taught self-control, dignity, and the pursuit of truth, yet ignored the torture and violence that took place within their own households. The contradiction extended into religion and ritual as well. Public ceremonies and festivals in honor of the gods often praised values like harmony, justice, and balance, while the same society treated thousands of enslaved people as expendable property. Temples were adorned with statues celebrating divine justice, yet offerings were paid for with wealth created by forced labor. This inconsistency was normalized to such an extent that very few questioned it, and those who did remained voices in the wilderness. Some thinkers, such as the Stoics, later hinted at a broader vision of human dignity, but their ideas never translated into practical abolition. Instead, Greek civilization continued to thrive on this paradox, presenting itself as the cradle of reason while sustaining itself through oppression. The legacy of this duality remains powerful today. When modern societies look back on ancient Greece as the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, they often overlook the hidden foundations of that brilliance. Without slaves to work the fields, tend the households, and serve the citizens, the men who became great philosophers and politicians would never have had the leisure to think, write, and debate. Here we are, standing at the glorious gates of the Greek symposium, that sacred ritual which modern textbooks love to portray as the shining crown of civilization. Oh yes, we've all heard the myth, noble free men gathering together, sipping wine in moderation, discussing philosophy, inventing democracy, dissecting the mysteries of existence while beautiful music drifts in the background. If you believe the sanitized versions in school books, a symposium was practically a classical TED Talk with better outfits and nicer furniture. Plato rose to speak, Socrates dropped his wisdom bombs, Aristophanes cracked a few clever jokes, and everyone politely applauded before heading home to sleep off the intellectual hangover. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? The truth, however, is far uglier, far darker, and far more human. The symposium was nothing less than a stage play where the first act might indeed start with lofty rhetoric, but the curtain always fell on a drunken carnival of violence, humiliation, and exploitation. Let's cut through the polished marble veneer. The symposium was not an innocent celebration of the mind. It was a ritual of domination. The evening began with the illusion of discipline. Wine was measured, conversations carefully steered toward grand themes of virtue, truth, and beauty. The men, reclining in comfort, fancied themselves philosophers of the cosmos. But here's the dirty little secret. As the wine flowed more freely, so did the masks of restraint dissolve, and the entire intellectual charade spiraled into chaos. The slaves entered the scene not as participants, never as equals, but as flesh, as tools, as commodities to be consumed. They poured the wine, strummed the lyres, danced when commanded, and when the conversation shifted from metaphysics to lust, they were dragged into back rooms or pushed onto the floor like disposable toys. And this wasn't an occasional abuse or some isolated excess. No, it was the built-in structure, the unspoken contract of the symposium. Just as predictable as the sunrise, the gathering that began with speeches about justice and the good life would inevitably end with a demonstration of raw power over those who had none. Imagine the scene. Men who moments earlier debated the immortality of the soul, now roaring with laughter as they force a terrified boy to sing or a young girl to dance until she collapses. Imagine lovers of wisdom who pen dialogues about temperance and virtue using drunken fists and violent lust to remind every slave in the room of their true status, nameless, voiceless, worthless. What we like to call Greek philosophy was written against this backdrop of cruelty. Picture Plato composing his dialogues while anonymous slaves stood silently behind him with trays of wine, knowing full well that when the night grew late enough, their own bodies might become part of the entertainment. Yet our textbooks maintain an almost religious silence about this. Why? Because it spoils the fairy tale of noble antiquity. Because the shining temple of Western thought looks much less glorious when you notice the bloodstains under the columns. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. These men wrote of love for the beautiful while twisting it into a license for sexual exploitation. They spoke of harmony of the soul while destroying the dignity of every servant forced to kneel at their feet. They debated justice while their homes were filled with people treated as livestock. To call this double morality is almost too generous. It was systematic theater, where intellectual brilliance provided the stage lights and suffering provided the spectacle. The very same society that gifted us the concept of democracy held that democracy, together with chains and whips, lubricated by the screams of the enslaved. And yet, in our cultural memory, the symposium remains wrapped in golden light, as if it were merely a wine-tasting festival of genius. All right, let's rip the mask off the marble statue and spit straight into the polished face of antiquity. Everyone loves to swoon over the so-called brilliance of Greek civilization, to stroke the stone chin of Pericles and whisper sweet nothings into the deaf ear of Plato's bust, pretending that these geniuses were sculptors of virtue and guardians of reason. But let's look at what lay beneath that perfect nose and those wise beards. An industrial machine for erasing human beings. Yes, erasing, not educating, not civilizing, but bleaching the soul until nothing remained but obedience. When the Greeks spoke of turning slaves into ideal servants, what they really meant was stripping them down like you strip bark off a tree, cutting until the raw wood of silence was left exposed. Names were the first thing to go. A name ties you to your mother's voice, to your father's hand, to the earth where you took your first steps. Take away a name and you take away the anchor. You throw a person into the ocean without a rope. Slaves were renamed like dogs, often with mocking little labels, or no name at all, just boy, girl, thing. How efficient. No more pesky individuality, no more stubborn memory of a village across the sea, just a replaceable unit in the factory of servitude. Then came the language purge. Don't speak your tongue. Don't hum your homeland songs. Don't tell bedtime stories to your children in the words your grandmother used. Greek masters weren't running some cultural exchange program. They were executing a linguistic lobotomy. The silence wasn't accidental. It was policy. Kill the words and you kill the thoughts, because what's a thought without a language? Just a fog of pain, impossible to articulate. And then, for the cherry on this poison cake, erase the memory of home. No stories of the hills you climbed, no songs about rivers that once gave you water, no myths of ancestors who fought the gods. Forget it all, because remembering makes you dangerous. Nostalgia becomes rebellion, pride becomes defiance, and gods forbid a slave should ever see themselves as more than the rag you used to polish your symposium couch. So they suffocated memory under layers of labor, humiliation, and constant threat. An amnesiac slave is a safe slave, because a hollow human cannot fight back. The Greeks were master craftsmen of this psychological engineering long before the modern state came up with re-education camps or company culture. Forget Orwell. Athens invented it first. Strip identity, install obedience. It wasn't enough to chain the body. Oh no, that would have been crude. They wanted to chain the soul, to amputate the invisible limbs of selfhood, and the brilliance of the plan was its cruelty disguised as normalcy. A slave didn't need to be whipped every day once the process was complete. By then, the whip was internalized, the chains were in the brain. The slave policed themselves because there was nothing left to protect, nothing left to resist for. Call it optimization, call it efficiency. I call it murder of the self. And the philosophers, those marble-mouthed hypocrites, didn't bat an eyelash. Plato writes about the forms, about eternal truth and the good, while somewhere in his own city, nameless bodies walked silently behind their masters, stripped of the very essence of being human. Aristotle, darling of logic, said some men are natural slaves, as if nature herself signed the paperwork for this annihilation of personality. But let's be honest, it wasn't nature, it was strategy, it was convenience, it was the maintenance of power by systematically carving out the humanity of the weak. This wasn't incidental cruelty, it was deliberate design. The system depended on it. Imagine a city filled with thousands of enslaved people who remembered their homes, their languages, their gods. You'd have uprisings every week, rivers of blood on marble steps. So the Greeks cut deeper, erased the memory, and you erased the danger. And it worked, most of the time. Symposia, those supposedly elevated feasts of ancient Greek thought where wine flowed like a river. And rhetoric, as many school textbooks would have it, reached the heights of divine revelation. But behind all this gilded pretension lay a very rotten foundation. And if one were to strip the marble mask from the Parthenon, it would turn out that behind the endless dialogues on virtue, justice, and beauty was a far more repulsive scene. Philosophers, those very same men we are accustomed to worship as beacons of civilization, turned into pathetic hypocrites. For everything began with dignity, with discussions on the nature of the soul, the cosmos, and the harmony of man with the world. But as the cups were refilled again and again, reason dissipated, and with it vanished that very sense of measure and virtue they so passionately preached, and the symposium degenerated into a bacchanalia where slaves ceased to be people and became voiceless targets for mockery. The irony being that those who could distinguish between categories of being and non-being saw no contradiction in publicly violating those they considered their property. And this was not simply the sins of an era. This was a system in which philosophy coexisted hand in hand with violence, as though one justified the other, for one cannot demand equality from those who built their very identity on superiority, and what is even more repulsive is that such scenes were perceived as part of the order of things. If you were a slave, your role was to be silent, endure, serve, and if necessary, become the victim of another's lust under the approving laughter of guests who an hour earlier debated the immortality of the soul. And here arises the question, did the Greeks truly have that so-called pure love of wisdom, or was philosophy merely another luxurious accessory? A beautiful screen for barbarism, because what is the use of Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle if their words about justice and ethics were spoken against the backdrop of whips and the cries of those not even regarded as human? And the most ironic part, if it is at all appropriate to laugh here, is that modern apologists of antiquity love to paint the symposium as a model of intellectual freedom, saying that ideas were born there that shaped Western civilization. And yes, ideas were indeed born, but let us not forget that they were carried in the womb of violence, and the cups from which philosophy poured were filled with blood and tears. And when we marvel at the ancient Greeks, we are, in essence, admiring a civilization that managed to virtuously combine aesthetics and cruelty, rhetoric and vice, Apollonian beauty and Dionysian madness, without recognizing any contradiction in it, and this duplicity, this filthy lining of the shining toga, is the real truth about symposia, a truth that rarely makes it into textbooks, because it is far more pleasant to tell stories of Plato and his symposium as a hymn to philosophy and love than to admit that love in those halls was often a synonym for exploitation. And let us be honest, if we were transported there, we would be shocked not only by the intellectual height of the discussions, but also by the animalistic, unashamed cruelty that the modern world would hastily name a crime against humanity. but at the time it was simply part of the evening, like dessert after wine. And this is precisely what makes ancient Greek symposia not the idealized source of wisdom, but rather a disgusting reminder that a great culture was built on small, broken people whom no one wished to see or hear until their screams became the accompaniment to philosophical speeches. The concept of small forms of resistance in ancient Greece may seem paradoxical at first glance, because when people think of resistance, they imagine uprisings, violent revolts, or escape from captivity. Yet in reality, resistance often existed in much more subtle and hidden ways, woven into everyday life and rooted in the deep need of enslaved people to preserve their humanity in a system that constantly tried to strip them of it. And although Greek society prided itself on philosophy, democracy, and the pursuit of excellence, for the enslaved majority who lived in its shadow, resistance meant survival, dignity, and the refusal to be fully crushed by the iron grip of bondage. And so, while many historical accounts have glorified the grand narratives of battles and political reform, the truer story of resilience is found in those tiny yet powerful gestures that kept the spirit alive in chains. For one of the most significant small acts of resistance was the preservation of memory through songs, as enslaved people who had been uprooted from their homes and sold into foreign lands used song as both a form of lament and a vessel of remembrance. And although the masters might not have understood the lyrics if they were sung in a foreign tongue, the slaves themselves created a secret world of meaning, weaving stories of their homelands, of rivers, mountains, gods, and ancestors, the melody becoming both protest and prayer, a reminder that no matter how harsh the present chains, there was once a past of freedom and identity, and perhaps someday there could be a future reclaimed, and such songs would often be whispered in the dim spaces of slave quarters, hummed while working in the fields, or passed from one generation to the next, subtly teaching children that they were more than the property of another, that they belonged to a heritage greater than slavery. And alongside songs there were also stories, narratives spoken in the quiet hours of night when masters were absent. Tales of heroism, of places left behind, of gods who punished arrogance and rewarded endurance. And these stories function not only as a cultural thread, but also as a coded reminder that the enslaved were not alone, that their suffering was seen by forces greater than their oppressors. And in this sense, storytelling became a quiet rebellion, a means of preserving collective identity when everything else was stolen, while another form of resistance emerged in crafts and small creations, because even within harsh labor, some slaves managed to carve tiny figurines, weave symbolic patterns into cloth, or shape everyday tools with hidden marks that only they understood. And these objects, seemingly insignificant to their masters, carried immense emotional and cultural weight, serving as tangible proof that they still had the ability to create, to shape, to express. And in a world where they were reduced to mere instruments of labor, this small act of creation was an assertion of humanity, of individuality, and of the refusal to be reduced to silence. For it is often said that art is the expression of freedom, and for slaves in Greece, even the smallest piece of crafted wood, a whispered lullaby or a woven motif, became a quiet declaration that their inner selves could not be enslaved. And importantly, memory of the dead was another cornerstone of this hidden resistance, because while Greek masters might have dismissed the passing of a slave as trivial, for the enslaved themselves, remembering those who had perished became sacred, and stories of the dead, names whispered in secrecy, or simple rituals of remembrance held in the shadows, were acts of defiance, affirming that even if their oppressors sought to erase them, they would not vanish from the hearts of their kin. And in this way, memory itself became resistance, for to be remembered was to exist beyond the dehumanization of slavery, and to forget would have been to accept the master's definition of them as disposable tools. And so through memory, the enslaved claimed dignity and continuity, saying, in essence, the concept of small forms of resistance in ancient Greece may seem paradoxical at first glance, because when people think of resistance, they imagine uprisings, violent revolts, or escape from captivity. Yet in reality, resistance often existed in much more subtle and hidden ways, woven into everyday life and rooted in the deep need of enslaved people to preserve their humanity in a system that constantly tried to strip them of it. And although Greek society prided itself on philosophy, democracy, and the pursuit of excellence, for the enslaved majority who lived in its shadow, resistance meant survival, dignity, and the refusal to be fully crushed by the iron grip of bondage. And so, while many historical accounts have glorified the grand narratives of battles and political reform, the truer story of resilience is found in those tiny yet powerful gestures that kept the spirit alive in chains. For one of the most significant small acts of resistance was the preservation of memory through songs, as enslaved people who had been uprooted from their homes and sold into foreign lands used song as both a form of lament and a vessel of remembrance. And although the masters might not have understood the lyrics if they were sung in a foreign tongue, the slaves themselves created a secret world of meaning, weaving stories of their homelands, of rivers, mountains, gods, and ancestors, the melody becoming both protest and prayer, a reminder that no matter how harsh the present chains, there was once a past of freedom and identity, and perhaps someday there could be a future reclaimed, and such songs would often be whispered in the dim spaces of slave quarters, hummed while working in the fields, or passed from one generation to the next, subtly teaching children that they were more than the property of another, that they belonged to a heritage greater than slavery. And alongside songs there were also stories, narratives spoken in the quiet hours of night when masters were absent. Tales of heroism, of places left behind, of gods who punished arrogance and rewarded endurance. And these stories function not only as a cultural thread, but also as a coded reminder that the enslaved were not alone, that their suffering was seen by forces greater than their oppressors. And in this sense, storytelling became a quiet rebellion, a means of preserving collective identity when everything else was stolen, while another form of resistance emerged in crafts and small creations, because even within harsh labor, some slaves managed to carve tiny figurines, weave symbolic patterns into cloth, or shape everyday tools with hidden marks that only they understood. And these objects, seemingly insignificant to their masters, carried immense emotional and cultural weight, serving as tangible proof that they still had the ability to create, to shape, to express. And in a world where they were reduced to mere instruments of labor, this small act of creation was an assertion of humanity, of individuality, and of the refusal to be reduced to silence. For it is often said that art is the expression of freedom, and for slaves in Greece, even the smallest piece of crafted wood, a whispered lullaby or a woven motif, became a quiet declaration that their inner selves could not be enslaved. And importantly, memory of the dead was another cornerstone of this hidden resistance, because while Greek masters might have dismissed the passing of a slave as trivial, for the enslaved themselves, remembering those who had perished became sacred, and stories of the dead, names whispered in secrecy, or simple rituals of remembrance held in the shadows, were acts of defiance, affirming that even if their oppressors sought to erase them, they would not vanish from the hearts of their kin. And in this way, memory itself became resistance, for to be remembered was to exist beyond the dehumanization of slavery, and to forget would have been to accept the master's definition of them as disposable tools. And so through memory, the enslaved claimed dignity and continuity, saying, in essence, the so-called economy of suffering in ancient Greece reveals one of the most brutal truths behind the splendor of temples, statues, and philosophical treatises. The system depended not only on the labor of slaves, but on the careful management of their pain, vitality, and eventual destruction, for the life of a slave was not valued in human terms but in economic categories of usefulness, strength, and marketability. And so youth and beauty became a kind of currency, while age, weakness, or disability turned a human being into waste to be discarded in the harshest environments imaginable. And to understand this is to see that the ancient Greek economy was not simply based on trade and agriculture, but on the calibrated exploitation of human lives, because young slaves, especially boys and girls in their prime, were often taken into households or palaces not for labor in the fields, but for entertainment, music, dancing, or pleasure, treated as living ornaments of wealth, as tokens of luxury to be paraded before guests at banquets and symposia. And their value resided less in what they could produce than in how they could flatter the egos and appetites of their masters, whether as musicians plucking lyres, dancers moving in rhythm, or companions expected to provide sexual gratification under the guise of service. And this commodification of youth turned human beings into consumables for elite amusement, while the elderly, the wounded, or those broken in body from years of toil were pushed to the other end of the spectrum, seen no longer as luxury items, but as disposable fuel for the dirtiest, most punishing tasks of the economy, particularly in the mines, where the Greeks extracted silver, copper, and other metals that financed their fleets, their wars, and their architectural marvels. For the mines were not simply workplaces, but death sentences, narrow tunnels carved deep into the earth, filled with dust, darkness, and suffocating heat, where slaves labored with picks and baskets from sunrise to collapse, rarely seeing daylight, and the mortality rate was staggering, with many perishing from exhaustion, accidents, or the slow poison of inhaled minerals. And yet for their masters this was efficient. Young and strong bodies were worth preserving for pleasure or sale. But the broken were better consumed in the bowels of the earth, where their suffering was invisible, their deaths unrecorded, and their labor converted directly into silver coins and bronze weapons. And this division of roles highlights the cruel arithmetic of the Greek slave system, in which every stage of a slave's life was monetized, from the moment of capture or purchase to the last gasp in a darkened shaft. For when young they were invested in as pleasures and status symbols, when strong they were exploited for fields, workshops, or armies, and when weak they were discarded into hellish labor until they ceased to exist. And there was no stage at which they were seen as fully human, only as economic functions. Which is why we can speak of an economy of suffering, because suffering itself was harnessed as a resource, maximizing profit through degradation. And one of the most chilling aspects is how normalized this became, with no outcry from philosophers who otherwise spoke at length about justice, virtue, and the ideal state. For while Plato and Aristotle theorized about the just order of society, thousands of slaves were dying underground so that their words could be written on papyrus, bought with silver, mined by broken men. And this contradiction was not seen as a contradiction at all, but as a natural order, with the elite convincing themselves that some people were born to rule and others to be ruled, some to enjoy leisure and others to embody misery. And so when we admire the glittering Acropolis or the masterpieces of sculpture, we must remember the invisible economy beneath them, the economy that extracted not only resources from the earth, but blood and life from countless enslaved bodies. Modern parallels are impossible to ignore when we attempt to compare the cruelty of slavery in ancient Greece with the exploitative systems that still shape our world today. Because although chains and whips are no longer the primary symbols of subjugation, exploitation itself has merely changed its clothing, trading the iron shackles of antiquity for subtler instruments of control such as economic dependency, corporate hierarchies, global inequalities, and the manipulation of human desires through the omnipresent machinery of technology and social media. And the first parallel that strikes us is the persistence of child labor, a phenomenon that on paper belongs to a bygone era, but in practice still flourishes in many corners of the globe where children as young as 5 or 6 toil in mines, plantations, sweatshops, or domestic service, deprived of education and of the carefree childhood that is a human right. And in this we see the same logic of commodification that reigned in ancient Greece, where young slaves were prized as flexible, cheap, and obedient workers. Except now the masters are not aristocrats reclining at a symposium, but faceless supply chains feeding the demands of global markets, multinational corporations, and consumers who seldom ask themselves at what human cost their low-priced clothing or electronics are produced. And alongside this persists the grotesque reality of human trafficking, a 21st century echo of the slave markets of Athens or Corinth, where individuals are bought and sold not under open skies, but through shadowy networks of organized crime, online advertisements, and corrupted officials who turn a blind eye. And just as in antiquity people were categorized into field laborers, domestic servants, or sexual slaves, so too now victims of trafficking are sorted into industries: forced labor, prostitution, illegal adoption, or organ trade. And what makes this parallel especially chilling is that our modern societies, which pride themselves on human rights and democratic values, sustain an underground economy that resembles in structure and brutality the very systems we condemn in history books. And if we expand the lens further, we encounter another insidious form of exploitation that is less visible but no less pervasive. The dependency on corporations that many workers around the world experience, where precarious contracts, low wages, absence of social protections, and the constant threat of replacement turn employment into a modern variant of servitude. Because when one must work 14 hours a day merely to pay rent and afford food, with no possibility of advancement, self-expression, or rest, then the line between wage labor and enslavement becomes dangerously thin, and critics argue that such conditions, often euphemized as flexible or competitive, mask a reality of desperation where workers sell not just their time, but their entire lives to survive, echoing the fate of ancient slaves who were tools in the hands of their masters. And in addition to economic exploitation, we must also address the manipulation of human consciousness through the omnipresence of social media, which may seem far removed from whips and chains, but which constitutes another form of control. Because when algorithms dictate what we see, think, and desire, when platforms harvest personal data to sell advertisements and influence elections, when people are trapped in cycles of addiction to validation, outrage, or consumption, then freedom becomes an illusion. And here again, we find a disturbing resonance with antiquity, where ideology and philosophy were sometimes employed to justify oppression. For just as Greek elites dressed up their privileges in lofty discourses about natural hierarchies and the inferiority of slaves, so too do modern corporations veil their manipulations under the language of connection, innovation, and empowerment, while in reality they create systems designed to profit from dependency, distraction, and psychological vulnerability. The main idea that unites the tragedies of history is painfully simple. All civilizations, regardless of time or geography, were built on the suffering of the weak, and societies across the ages have shown an almost uncanny tendency to avert their eyes from violence and exploitation whenever it could be reframed as the cost of progress. And when we look at ancient Greece, so often celebrated as the cradle of democracy and philosophy, we must also remember the countless slaves whose lives were crushed to maintain the splendor of temples, marketplaces, and intellectual salons, just as when we admire the pyramids of Egypt, we cannot forget that they were erected by exhausted laborers who had no choice but to obey. Or when we marvel at the glory of Rome, we must remember that its aqueducts, amphitheaters, and roads were not simply feats of engineering, but monuments to the expendability of human bodies treated as raw material. And this uncomfortable pattern persists through medieval kingdoms, colonial empires, industrial revolutions, and even the contemporary globalized economy. Because beneath every golden age, behind every story of progress and cultural achievement, there is always a shadow where the weak carried the burden, endured the violence, and paid the price. And what is most disturbing is not simply that suffering existed, but that societies normalized it, taught themselves to look away, to disguise cruelty with rhetoric, to call it necessary, inevitable, or even natural, and thus violence became not only tolerated, but integrated into the very definition of civilization itself, because progress was measured not by how humanely societies treated their most vulnerable members, but by the splendor of monuments, the reach of empires, the scale of wealth, or the brilliance of intellectual ideas, while the suffering that sustained all this was erased, silenced, or dismissed as unworthy of memory. And this blindness is not confined to antiquity. For in every epoch we find similar rationalizations. The exploitation of peasants justified as divine order in feudal societies, the enslavement of Africans defended as economic necessity by colonial powers, the sweatshops of industrialization dismissed as temporary sacrifices for prosperity, and in our own age the devastation of the environment, the use of child labor in supply chains, or the erosion of mental health under relentless corporate and digital pressure is routinely accepted as the unavoidable cost of progress. So the main thought we must confront is that civilization itself has often been less a triumph of justice and more a machine for transforming the pain of the weak into the comfort of the powerful. And while people in each era believed themselves enlightened compared to the past, the same mechanism endured because human societies are extraordinarily skilled at hiding the foundations of their own prosperity, at celebrating surface achievements while burying the violence that made them possible. And if we are honest, this is not simply hypocrisy, but a structural necessity of how power operates, for it is always easier to admire the shining city, the monument, or the invention than to face the countless invisible lives that were sacrificed to create them. And the lesson that arises from this is not simply historical cynicism, but a call to recognize the patterns in our present, because just as ancient Greeks could speak of justice while whipping slaves, we too may talk about human rights while tolerating sweatshops. Just as Romans entertained themselves with spectacles in arenas while ignoring the agony of gladiators, we too consume media or technology that is born from hidden suffering. And this cycle continues until society finally dares to acknowledge that the measure of true progress is not the greatness of its cultural products, but the dignity with which it treats its weakest members. And if we fail to grasp this, we will continue to repeat the same error, to glorify civilization as an abstract success while ignoring the countless individual failures.